I work for a nonprofit in a fairly large city in the New England area. Think bigger than most Midwestern cities, but nowhere near as big as NYC. I'm trying to keep this as vague as possible without leaving out important details, as I do love my job and I would hate for this to impact it somehow. That being said, very recent events have made it difficult to stay silent, and I desperately need some advice on what to do next. So anyways, the nonprofit I work for specifically serves homeless and underprivileged boys and young men in our city. We offer food, shelter, showers, you name it. Anything to keep them off the streets is what our founder has always said. He's been running things since the late 70s and simply refuses to retire. He spent most of his childhood homeless, so I guess he made it his personal mission to help as many youth as he could. I work on the admin side, so I don't actually see the ones we help out as much, but it's still very fulfilling work. Recently, my main focus has been on house hunting of all things. We've long since outgrown our current facilities in the city. With some creative thinking, we've been able to make it work longer than it probably should have, but now we're at the point where we've been forced to turn some kids away. We all hate it, most of all the owner, so we decided to find some room in the budget and put it towards finding a second location. My budget was pretty restrictive, especially considering how much space we needed. For this and a few other reasons, we decided to look in more of the rural areas outside of town. It takes a couple hours to get out of the urban sprawl, but after that, it pretty abruptly falls off into forests and farmland. Growing up in the city myself, it honestly feels like driving on an alien planet, but I can't deny how peaceful it is. After a few months with absolutely zero listings in our price range, I finally found one that we could afford, and that wasn't too far away. It was a big ranch-style home on a few acres all to itself. It even had a barn that we could probably repurpose into additional lodging at some point. The price seemed almost too good to be true, but the house did need some serious work just looking at the pictures, and I was sure even more would be found during an inspection. Me and a few other members of the admin team drove out that same day to take a look. The realtor selling the place was your textbook small-town celebrity. As we met with him, he greeted every other person by name as they passed by on the street, and when we asked about the work needing to be done on the house, he rattled off a list of a dozen contractors in the area that he knew personally. He had a big smile and a way of talking that made me feel like we had already bought the place. The realtor told us the history of the lot, how it had been owned by a prominent local family for generations. Multiple members of the family had served as mayors or judges in town, going back over 200 years. The family even had a small church built on the property back in the early 1800s, the only church in town for quite a while. Unfortunately, it had been demolished back in the 1930s. He said the foundation is still out in the wooded area of the lot somewhere, though it's pretty much entirely grown over with grass and other foliage now. I asked why the family had decided to sell the place after so long, and he told us how the only remaining descendants had passed away recently with no apparent heirs, and they willed it and everything else they had to the town. There was some push from the locals to turn it into a museum, but the city council didn't figure they really had the tourism draw to keep such a thing going. The realtor said he was surprised to hear back on the listing so quickly since everyone seems to be moving to the city, not so much the other way around. We asked a few more questions and pretended to take the night to mull it over, but we were already sold. Even after the inspections and all the estimates, it still came in just under budget. It needed a lot of work for sure, but it had that rustic charm. Or maybe the realtor was just really good at selling things. The other admins were already drawing up plans of how everything would be situated and the best ways to utilize the space. We called him back first thing in the morning. We closed on it just over a month ago. Since then, I've mainly been in charge of going out there and meeting with and checking on contractors as we get the place fixed up. The goal is to have it ready before the holiday season, as that always tends to be a busy time of year for us. Things have been progressing smoothly aside from a few hiccups here or there. I normally go up every few days for an hour or two. Last weekend I drove up as usual on Friday to take a look. We have electrical and plumbing fully finished now, and after some work on the north-facing wall that was just completed, it was mostly rotted out. The home is now officially inhabitable. It still needs new flooring in most of the house, a new AC and furnace, new hot water heater, new light fixtures, etc. But just being able to live in it felt like a pretty significant milestone. I had a busy morning, so I got there a little later than usual this time, and within the hour, the workers had packed up and left for the day. I knew if I left then I would just be sitting in rush hour traffic for hours, so I figured this would be the perfect time to get some updated pictures to send the rest of the team. So I spent the next hour or so walking around and snapping pics of the progress. After I finished up, the sun had started to set, so I decided to head out. That is until I realized that I must have driven over a rogue nail on my way into the driveway. My front left tire was completely flat. Lovely, and of course that tire was already the spare. That's on me I guess, but I will say that the work I do doesn't exactly afford me a ton of extra cash each month. For this same reason, I was also hesitant to call somebody out to tow me who knows how far to the nearest tire shop that was still open. And so I made the decision to test out just how inhabitable the place really was. I had some old blankets in the trunk and an extra phone charger. It would be kinda like camping, I thought, or at least as close as a city boy like me had ever experienced. I called the others at work and let them know, half hoping one of them would offer to drive out and pick me up. No luck. While I still had some light, I walked back down the winding driveway to close the main gate by the road. Then I brought the blankets in from the car and set up a small sleeping area in the living room. All in all, it was comfortable enough. It was a bit drafty and the place creaked and moaned like any old house. I also found the moonlight peeking through the thick forests a little unsettling. The way the trees moved in the wind made my mind play tricks on itself, seeing figures in the tree trunks and movement in the branches. I wish we had curtains I could pull shut to stop the shadows from dancing across the floor all around me. I walked around the house to make sure everything was shut up and locked before I crawled into my homemade floor mattress and tried to go to sleep. A few hours later, I woke up abruptly. It felt like that telltale sensation of falling that jolts you from a dream, though I didn't remember dreaming anything just prior. It took a minute for me to calm myself back down, and I decided I might as well get some water before I went back to sleep. As I stood up, I glanced out the window and went still. There was light coming out from the woods. Not moonlight, warm yellow light, flickering through the thick bramble of trees. My first thought was some sort of forest fire. My heart dropped as my mind went to the worst case scenario. I pictured the place going up in smoke so close to it being finished. We'd be back to square one. I pulled my shoes on quickly and grabbed my phone as I headed out the back door. I wasn't excited about trudging through the woods in the middle of the night, but I needed to confirm if there was a fire so I could call someone as soon as possible. Trudging was definitely the right word. I had to lift my knees high to step through the thick underbrush as small branches smacked me in the face and cut into my arms. I had my phone flashlight on, but it didn't help much with the leaves being as thick as they were. After a few minutes, I had almost decided to head back and just call the fire department to be safe. But just then, I saw what looked like the edge of a clearing, where the yellow flickering light was much brighter. I pushed forward a little more and broke through the tree line. What I saw confused me more than anything. No forest fire lanterns, small, handheld oil lanterns, and they were being carried by a line of people walking calmly down a worn dirt path through the woods. They were only maybe 20 feet away, at least 50 of them. There were men, women, and children, and they all wore simple black and white clothes that looked like something out of the Crucible. I stood dumbfounded and realized that I must still be asleep, but I couldn't wake up. I bit my lip and closed my eyes, but the procession remained when I opened them. The end of the line was just about to pass me. I yelled at them. I don't remember what I said. Not that it mattered much, because they didn't react at all. They just kept walking, so I followed them. What else was I supposed to do? As I fell in behind the last of them, I realized it was what seemed to be a small family, a young man and woman with a small boy in tow. The woman was crying. I tried to reach out to one of them, but my hand always seemed just too far away, like some sort of optical illusion. I shouted again, and again got no feedback whatsoever. As I continued following them, I saw some sort of structure at the end of the path. It was simply built and painted white. The roof rose up sharply on both sides to a steep point at the top. There were a set of double doors opening right onto the path, with a half-circle window sitting atop them. It looked like a church. I kept telling myself I should just run back to the house and pull the covers over my head, but I followed anyway. The people filed neatly into the church, which seemed to be lit with bright oil lanterns along the walls inside and flanking the door on the outside. As the congregation entered, they snuffed out their handheld lanterns and bowed to a man at the door. It took a few minutes to get to the front of the line, and the family in front of me also bowed. As they did, the man at the door, who until this point had remained statuesque, reached forward and placed a hand on the woman's shoulder. He leaned close and said something to her. She nodded back, but didn't stop crying. I slipped inside behind them, and I felt a cool gust at my back as the doors closed. The family sat down in one of the pews which lined the main aisle. At the end of the aisle was a simple wooden podium standing on a raised platform. Beyond it was a small opening to another room or hallway. The man at the door walked past me down the aisle. The room was completely silent as all of the congregation sat with their heads bowed. As the man took his place behind the podium, he called out in a language I didn't understand. It sounded kind of like Latin. He spoke for a few moments and then was met with a response from the group in unison. This went back and forth for a few minutes. Occasionally, a man who sat nearest the podium would ring a bell, and the people would all look upward for a few seconds before returning their gaze to the ground. The man stepped out from behind the podium and held out his hands as he spoke once more. This time it sounded like a question. After a silence that seemed just a bit too long, a weak, faltering voice answered from the rear of the room. The mother stood up with her son and stepped into the aisle. As they did, the father took the son's hand and said something to him before reluctantly letting go. The mother kneeled down and embraced the young boy. She cried openly, but no one else moved or reacted at all. The boy himself looked unfazed. He wrenched himself from her grasp and started walking down the aisle. The woman collapsed on the floor, and only then did her husband move to help her back into the pew. The man at the podium smiled as the boy approached him, and all of the people in the church bowed and repeated something under their breath as he walked past their row. The man at the podium took the boy's hand and led him through the opening at the back. For a few minutes, no one moved or spoke. It felt like an eternity, finally broken only by the ringing of the bell once more, though this time it echoed from far away. In unison, everyone in the church stood again and began filing into the same opening. The tension wrapped tightly around my chest. I began running through the crowd towards the back of the church. As I passed by people, it seemed as though I partially moved through them somehow, and my whole body shivered. I reached the open doorway and found only a small room, not much bigger than a closet, but set into the ground was a large wooden hatch held open with a metal hook on the wall. Carved stone steps led down into an inky abyss. I remember thinking in that moment, if I go down there, I may never be the same, but I went down anyway, like a moth to a campfire. The steps led down deeper than I thought, and they ended in a large stone room. Some of the congregation was already here. They knelt on the cold, hard floor with their hands flat on the ground in front of them. As more entered, they assumed the same position. Beyond them, the only light in the room came from a small candelabra. It sat on a wide stone altar. The boy lay on the altar with his eyes closed and his arms crossed over his chest. The man from the podium stood behind him and chanted something as he held a small metal pitcher above his head. On the wall behind them was a taxidermied bullhead with great big horns. Only the bottom of it was lit by the candles, and even glancing at it made me feel an overwhelming sense of dread. I looked away just in time to see the last of the group entering and kneeling down. It was the mother and father. They both moved as if partially comatose, almost trance-like. The man at the altar spoke once more. This time there were no responses from the group. Every few sentences he would stop and pour something from the pitcher onto the child in front of him. It looked clear, but it was thicker than water. The boy didn't react, even as the man poured the liquid over his face. After this repeated a handful of times, he upended the pitcher entirely and emptied it. He then turned from the boy and faced the bullhead mounted on the wall. He spoke once more, again sounding like a question, before he joined everyone else in kneeling on the ground with his hands forward. In a moment, all the air in the room seemed to evaporate. I couldn't breathe, and it sounded as if I was in a vacuum. My heart seemed to beat irregularly and I nearly fell to the ground. And then I heard it, or I felt it, or I sensed it, I don't know. Something in the silence, a more intense pressure, like something pushing on my eardrums and my eyes at the same time. I tried to gasp as I felt my lungs flatten in my chest. I saw some of the people on the floor start to react similarly, and at the height of everything, I saw the candelabra tip over on its own and fall onto the altar. All at once, a cacophony of sight and sound erupted in the small room. The boy's body erupted in flames. People screamed, some in terror, though most in some sick sense of euphoria. The flames licked up onto the ceiling and spread along it, bathing the whole room in radiant heat. The boy's body convulsed and flailed. The man at the altar laughed as he danced around with glee, and the flames parted just enough to see the bull's head on the wall, fully illuminated in a dark red hue. For a split second, I swear I saw it move. My senses caught up to me and I ran from the room faster than I've ever moved before. I flew up the stairs, taking 2 or 3 with each stride. The screaming and laughing did not die down behind me. As I reached the top of the steps, I was relieved to find the hatch still open, and even more relieved to see the front door to the church once again open at the far end of the aisle. I continued running, nearly tripping and falling around the podium in my mad scramble. I never looked back, even as I found myself once again on the dirt pathway. I just kept running, even when I no longer knew where I was or where I was going. The path eventually ended, and I found myself back in the thick mess of trees. They cut into me even sharper than before as I pushed through frantically. By some miracle, I happened to spy the house again through the leaves. I ran inside and locked the door. I crawled into my blankets and stayed there unmoving for some length of time. After a while, I worked up the courage to glance out the window again for just a second. No light in the woods, nothing to see. I retreated to my safe space again. I didn't move until I saw sunlight through the threads of the sheets. That's where I am now, sitting on the floor in this empty house, wrapped in tattered old blankets. If I had fallen back asleep afterwards, I would have written it off as a nightmare, but I have the fresh cuts on my arms and legs and still wet mud on my shoes to prove otherwise. I don't know how, but it was all real, more real than anything I've ever experienced. I don't know what to do. Should I call the police? I want to tell the others at work, but I know they'll just think I've lost it. Part of me thinks I should go back out and see if anything is still there, get some pictures or something, but the thought of going back there makes me sick. There's something in the woods, and I think it's been there a long time.